First, I'll summarize eating Christmas at the Kalahari. Richard Lee explains that the Kung learned about Christmas indirectly from missionaries and neighboring Bantu groups. So their version is simplified and tied to local customs, especially the Tswana Herero practice of slaughtering an ox as a goodwill gift. Each December, people gather at cattle posts for trading, matchmaking, and multi-day trance dance feast. As an anthropologist studying Kung hunting and gathering, Lee avoided giving up food to keep his research unbiased, but his stock of canned goods made him appear wealthy and sometimes stingy. To thank the community and to mark his last field Christmas, he bought a huge black ox only to face public teasing that it was too old and too thin. Worried that the meat would be insufficient and might spark fights, Lee tried to find a fatter animal, but failed and reluctantly decided to serve the ox anyway. When it was butchered, the chest revealed thick layers of fat. The villagers laughed at their earlier complaints, and the feast lasted 2 days with plenty to eat. Lee then learned that the insult had been deliberate. The Kung routinely belittles kills to check pride and enforce humility. The episode taught him that gifts are interpreted through social relationships, and the outsider assumptions can be misread local meanings, and that the Kung skeptical communal practices serve important social functions. Next, I'll discuss how the article illustrates the impact of worldview on the interpretation of cultural meanings. Lee's story about buying a big ox for a Kung Christmas shows the same action can mean very different things to different cultures. Lee thought a large public gift would show generosity and earn thanks because that is how gift giving in his culture works. He had avoided sharing food during the research, so the ox was meant to fix any idea that he was stingy and to mark his last Christmas in the field, as previously discussed. The Kung, however, learned about Christmas from neighboring groups and tied the holiday to local customs like the Tswana and Herero practice of slaughtering an ox. So their rules about meat and sharing came from those local meetings. When people teased the ox as a big bag of bones, Lee took it as rejection and worried the gift had failed. Later, he learned that teasing was a normal Kung practice. They insult kills and gifts on purpose to stop people from getting proud and to keep everyone equal. That teasing helps the group stay together rather than break apart. When the ox was butchered, it turned out to be fatty and plentiful, and laughter showed the earlier insults were social trick, not true criticism. The story matches advice from public health and evaluation work that says you must understand local customs before judging actions. Do not assume your own culture's meaning is the right one. Lee's mistake shows how an outsider's worldview can hide the real logic of local behavior and how asking insiders and watching carefully can correct those misunderstandings. Now on to exocentric biases. Lee showed an ethnocentric bias when he assumed that buying a large ox for the Kung people would be seen as purely generous act. Coming from a Western worldview, he believed generosity should bring visible gratitude and a public thanks. Because of this, when the villagers teased him by calling the ox a bag of bones, he misread their words as rejection and disrespect. In reality, the Kung were following their own cultural practice of ritual teasing, which is used to keep people humble, prevent arrogance, and maintain equality in the group. Lee's mistake was judging their action through his own cultural lens instead of trying to understand theirs. The bias mattered because it shaped how Lee felt and delayed his learning. He became humiliated and thought he had failed, when in fact, the teasing was a normal part of their social system. Only later did he realize that the insults were purposeful and functional, not hostile. This shows how worldview filters perception. People often interpret unfamiliar actions through familiar categories unless they stop to ask questions and seek local explanations. Guidance on cultural competence stresses the importance of engaging with insiders, asking what behaviors mean, and avoiding the imposition of outside assumptions. Now I'll reflect on how this story challenges the notion that one's cultural values are normal or best. The Kung used teasing on purpose when someone brings meat or gives a gift. Calling an ox thin is not an insult or meant to hurt. It is a social trick that keeps people humble. Richard Lee, coming from a culture where big gifts should get loud thanks, heard the teasing as rejection. That shows how your background makes you read other people's words the wrong way. The same comment can mean very different things on different groups. The lesson is simple. There is no single right way to behave. Saying thank you loudly is normal in some places, but quiet modesty or joking criticism can be right response in others because it protects fairness and community. If you work across cultures, slow down, ask what things mean, and don't assume your way is the only way. Now to cover something that's un- like norm and a tradition in my own culture and how it might be perceived by an outsider based on their own worldview. Direct, blunt feedback is common in many Western workplaces because it is seen as efficient and fair. But people from other cultures that value harmony and protecting social standing often hear that directness as rude or shaming. If you treat frank criticism as the default, you risk embarrassing or alienating colleagues who expect corrections to be handled in ways that preserve dignity and relationships. A good best practice for communicating across cultures is to slow down before you judge what someone says or does. Instead of reacting right away, pause to ask insiders what the behavior means. Watch how the community responds and then reframe your first impression based on their logic. The simple habit helps prevent misunderstanding, keeping relationships strong, and make communication more effective across different worldviews. This works best because worldview shapes how people expect speech and actions to be understood. What feels normal or polite in one culture might carry or a complete different meaning to another. By asking and observing first, you avoid forcing your own culture and assumptions onto others, and instead learn the rules that guide meaning in their community. For example, in this article, when the community teased the ox by calling it a bag of bones, the author first thought they were rejecting his gift. Later, he learned that the teasing was a cultural practice meant to keep people humble and prevent arrogance. If he had paused to ask and observe before reacting, he would have understood the teasing as a social tool rather than an insult. In my own experience working in a treatment center, I witnessed a cultural misunderstanding that had serious consequences. A Native American client was labeled as disrespectful by her counselor because she took time to respond to questions and and, avoided engaging in drama that did not directly involve her. The counselor interpreted the silence and restraint through a Western lens, assuming it meant defiance or lack of cooperation. As a result, the client was placed in a hot seat, which humiliated her and ultimately led her to leave treatment early before she could graduate. What the counselor failed to recognize was that the behavior was a normal practice within her tribe, rooted in cultural values of patience, reflection, and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Had the counselor taken time to learn about the cultural background, the client's actions would have been understood as respectful and consistent with her upbringing rather than as a resistance. The situation parallels the example in Eating Christmas at the Kalahari, where the Kung people used ritualized insults to preserve equality and prevent arrogance. Outsiders like Lee initially misunderstood the teasing as hostile, when in fact it was a social tool designed to ma- maintain group cohesion. In both cases, different worldviews shaped how behaviors were perceived. Silence and restraint were misread as disrespect in the treatment center, while ritualized teasing was misread as rejection in the Kalahari. The biggest lesson from this article is that our worldview can completely change how we understand other people's actions. Lee thought the teasing about the ox meant he had failed because in his culture, generosity is usually met with praise and thanks. But the Kung were not insulting him. They were following their own tradition to keep him humble. His feelings of humiliation came from his own cultural lens, not from their intentions. This shows that if we do not stop and check our perceptions, we can easily misread others and damage relationships in other intercultural communications. The most important idea is to remember that what feels normal or respectful in one culture may mean something very different in another.